77-year-old Dorothy lives quietly in a care home, still carrying the pain of her husband George disappearing 40 years ago. One day she receives a shocking letter in his handwriting, revealing that he is alive, dying, and desperate to explain why he vanished. If you want to know what happened with him and how Dorothy spent all years alone, keep watching this story. Also subscribe to our channel to get more stories like this. Dorothy Bennett woke before the bells every morning. Not because she had to, because old habits survived long after the people who taught them were gone. At 6:30, the care home was quiet except for the low mechanical hum of radiators and the distant clatter of breakfast trays being prepared downstairs. Dawn pressed pale gray light through the curtains of her room, touching the edges of framed photographs and the knitted blanket folded perfectly across the foot of her bed. She sat up slowly, one hand resting against the ache in her hip, until it passed. "Still here?" she whispered to herself. Then she smiled. It was something she said every morning, half joke, half prayer. Dorothy Bennett was 77 years old, and she refused to become fragile simply because the world expected it from women her age. The nurses adored her, not because she was sweet, she wasn't, always, because she remained unmistakably herself. Sharp, proud, particular. She corrected grammar, folded her own laundry, refused help opening jars even when her hands trembled with arthritis afterward. She wore lipstick every day because she believed surrender began in tiny places. The younger residents watched television all afternoon. Dorothy watched people. That was how she spent most mornings now, beside the window in the common room with a cup of weak tea she constantly complained about but always finished. Outside, rain painted silver lines across the garden stones. Inside, the home smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, overcooked vegetables, and old books. Life, she often thought, had a smell when it was nearing its end. Not death, just memory. Morning dot. Young Amy appeared carrying folded towels against her chest. 26. Bright-eyed, fast-moving. The kind of person who still believed problems could be solved if you loved hard enough. Dorothy liked her immediately because Amy never used the voice. That soft, slow voice people used with the elderly, as though age had made them children again. "Morning, Amy. You're up early again." "I'm old, not dead." Amy laughed. "There she is." Dorothy pretended not to enjoy making the girl laugh, but secretly she lived for it. Some mornings, laughter was proof the heart still worked. Amy leaned closer. "Mrs. Hargrove says you cheated at cards yesterday." Dorothy lifted her chin. "I did not cheat. You won 12 pounds. I won strategically." Amy shook her head, smiling as she continued down the corridor. Dorothy watched her disappear. Youth moved differently, like time was endless. At 77, Dorothy understood the opposite. Every conversation could become the last one. Every ordinary day was quietly miraculous. By 9 o'clock, the home had awakened fully. Television murmured in the lounge. Someone coughed endlessly down the hall. A radio played old Frank Sinatra songs near the nurse's station. Dorothy returned to her room after breakfast and locked the door behind her, not because anyone would enter without knocking, because some rituals belonged to privacy. She crossed slowly to the bedside drawer, opened it carefully, and removed the photograph. The edges had softened over 40 years of handling. George stood beside her beneath the old elm tree behind their first house. Summer sunlight lit his face. He was smiling sideways at her instead of the camera, as though he'd forgotten anyone else existed. Dorothy stared at him for a long time. 40 years. 40 years since George Bennett kissed her goodbye before work and vanished from the face of the earth. No body, no goodbye, no explanation, just absence. The police searched rivers, questioned neighbors, interviewed coworkers. Weeks became months, Months became years. Eventually, people stopped saying missing and started saying dead. Everyone except Dorothy, because deep inside her, beneath the rage and humiliation and grief, she had always known George had chosen to leave. That truth sat inside her like a stone she could never swallow. Their children grew up believing their father died. Dorothy allowed it. It was kinder than the alternative. She raised 3 children alone while working 2 jobs. She attended school plays alone, paid bills alone, sat awake through fevers alone. And every night after the house slept, she opened this drawer and looked at his face, not because she forgave him, because hatred required memory too. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dorothy? Amy again. Dorothy slid the photo back into the drawer instantly. Yes? The door opened slightly. There's a delivery downstairs for you later. Also, Anna called. She's visiting Sunday. Dorothy nodded. Her daughter never missed a Sunday? Good, Dorothy said. Amy hesitated. You okay? Perfectly. Amy studied her a second longer. The young noticed less than older people thought. But sometimes they noticed exactly enough. After lunch, rain thickened against the windows. Dorothy spent the afternoon reading in silence while other residents dozed in armchairs around her. At 5, she returned upstairs. At 6, she brushed silver powder across her cheeks out of habit she no longer questioned. At 7:30, she sat on the edge of her bed and held George's photograph again. You selfish man, she whispered. But her voice trembled softly around the words. Because memory was cruel, it preserved laughter long after anger should have erased it. That night, wind rattled branches against the building. Dorothy slept lightly, and somewhere beyond the walls of the care home, 40 years of silence began moving toward her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It looked ordinary. Cream envelope, blue ink, 1 postage stamp slightly crooked in the corner. Amy carried it into the lounge, balanced atop a stack of medical forms. Post for you, Dot. Dorothy barely glanced up from her crossword. Probably charity begging. Amy handed it over casually, then stopped, because Dorothy had gone completely still. Not dramatic, not shocked, still in the way animals become still when danger enters a room. The crossword pencil slipped from her fingers. Amy frowned. Dorothy? But Dorothy wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes were locked on the handwriting. A capital D curved exactly the way it used to. Sharp downward pressure on the T in Bennett. She knew that handwriting better than her own. For one impossible second, the room tilted sideways. The sounds around her faded into something underwater and distant. Television static. Teacups clinking. Someone laughing far away. 40 years vanished. She was 29 again, standing at the kitchen window, waiting for headlights that never came home. Amy crouched beside her. Hey, are you all right? Dorothy swallowed once. Her fingers tightened around the envelope so hard the paper bent. Yes, but the word came out thin and strange. Amy touched her arm gently. Do you want me to stay? No. Too quickly. Too sharply. Dorothy softened her voice. I'm sorry. No, dear. I'm fine. Amy looked unconvinced, but she nodded and stood slowly. If you need anything. Dorothy waited until she walked away, then stared again at the envelope. No return address. Only her name, Mrs. Dorothy Bennett, as if whoever wrote it still believed she deserved respect. Her hands shook violently now. She slipped the envelope into her cardigan pocket before anyone could notice. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. Voices came and went around her. Someone asked about dinner. Someone complained about the rain. Dorothy answered automatically while her pulse hammered inside her throat. George? Impossible. Dead men did not write letters, unless they had never been dead at all. Dinner tasted like nothing. By 8 o'clock, she excused herself early and returned upstairs. The hallway lights glowed dim amber against floral wallpaper faded by decades of sunlight. Her room felt smaller tonight, airless. She locked the door, sat carefully on the bed, and removed the envelope. For several minutes, she simply held it, feeling the weight, the texture. Real paper, real ink. 40 years collapsed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. Finally, she slid one finger beneath the seal, opened it slowly. Several pages unfolded inside. Her breath caught instantly at the first line. Dorothy, if this letter has reached you, then I am still alive long enough to tell you the truth myself. I have imagined this moment for 40 years and feared it every single day. She stopped reading, covered her mouth. Tears burned suddenly behind her eyes, not from sadness but fury. 40 years. 40 years, and he began with politeness. She almost tore the pages in half. Instead, she kept reading. I know I have no right to ask anything from you. Not forgiveness, not understanding, certainly not kindness. But I am dying. The doctors say weeks, perhaps less. And before I leave this world, I cannot allow you to carry the wrong story any longer. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. Dorothy laughed aloud then. A bitter, broken sound. Of course you did, she whispered. But her hands kept turning pages. George's writing remained beautiful despite age, steady, measured, almost painfully calm. I have rehearsed explanations in my mind for decades, and none of them are enough. There are things you never knew about me. Things I hid because I was ashamed. Things I believed would destroy our family if they came into the light. When I disappeared, I thought I was protecting you. I understand now that I destroyed you instead. There are truths about your life, Dorothy, that you deserve before I die. Please, if there is anything left in your heart besides hatred, write to me. The address was written at the bottom, a hospice 3 towns away. Dorothy lowered the pages slowly. Rain whispered against the windows. The radiator hissed softly, and inside her chest, something old and buried began clawing upward toward the surface. Not hope, something far more dangerous. Questions. She sat awake until midnight, rereading every word, examining each sentence like evidence from a crime scene. There are things you never knew about me. The line repeated endlessly inside her mind. At 1:30, there was a soft knock. Amy's voice drifted through the door. Dorothy, I saw your light. Dorothy hesitated, then opened it. Amy took one look at her face and immediately stepped inside without speaking. Dorothy handed her the letter silently. Amy read in stunned silence. Oh my God. Dorothy stared toward the rain-dark window. He's alive. The words sounded unreal, spoken aloud. Amy sat carefully beside her. Do your children know? No? What will you do? Dorothy laughed weakly. That's the terrible thing. She looked down at the pages in her lap. I still don't know whether I want him dead or alive. Anna arrived Sunday morning, wearing anger before she even entered the room. Dorothy had called 2 days earlier, not to discuss, only to tell her. A mistake, perhaps? But secrets had already destroyed enough of their family. Anna stood near the doorway, gripping her handbag tightly while Dorothy sat by the window. The resemblance between them had deepened with age. Same eyes, same stubborn mouth, same tendency to survive quietly. He wrote you a letter, not a question. Dorothy nodded once. Anna laughed in disbelief. After 40 years. Yes. And you answered? Not yet. Anna turned away instantly. Dorothy saw tears forming before her daughter hid them. That man abandoned us. The word us cracked sharply in the room. He abandoned you, Anna continued. He abandoned me, Michael, Claire. He vanished and let us think he was dead. Dorothy spoke softly. I know. No, I don't think you do. Anna faced her now, voice trembling. You know what my childhood was? Watching you pretend everything was fine while people whispered behind your back. Watching you work until your hands bled. Hearing other children ask why my father disappeared. Dorothy looked down because every word was true. I buried him, Anna whispered. I buried him in my mind years ago, and now suddenly he writes a beautiful little letter because he's dying? The cruelty of it struck Dorothy too. Not the letter, the timing. George had returned only when death cornered him. I'm not defending him, Dorothy said quietly. Anna stared at her mother with heartbreak and disbelief tangled together. Then why are you even considering this? Dorothy opened her mouth, closed it again, because she didn't fully understand herself. Finally, she whispered, because 40 years is a very long time to not know why someone stopped loving you. Anna's expression shattered instantly. Oh, Mom. There it was, the hidden wound. Not abandonment, not struggle, not humiliation. The deeper terror beneath all of it. Why wasn't I enough to stay for? Anna crossed the room and knelt beside her mother. He didn't leave because of you. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Dorothy shook her head slowly. You were children. You didn't hear the silences. You didn't see the distance before he disappeared. Anna gripped her hand. You loved him? I hated him. You loved him first. Dorothy closed her eyes. That was the tragedy, wasn't it? Love didn't vanish cleanly. It rotted slowly, leaving pieces behind. Anna stood again, suddenly angry once more because grief often disguised itself that way. What if he's lying? What if this is some cruel game? I don't think so. How can you possibly know? Dorothy answered without hesitation. Because he sounds ashamed. Silence settled heavily between them. Anna wiped her face roughly. You owe him nothing. I know. Then promise me you won't let him hurt you again. Dorothy almost smiled. At 55, Anna still spoke like a daughter trying to protect her mother from storms. I'll be careful. Anna shook her head. That's not what I asked. But Dorothy said nothing more. After Anna left, twilight crept slowly across the care home windows. The corridor smelled faintly of soup and disinfectant. Somewhere downstairs, an old man shouted at a television game show. Life continued, as though nothing had shifted. But inside Dorothy, everything had. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat awake in the common lounge wrapped in a cardigan, while rain tapped steadily against the dark windows. Amy found her there near midnight. I thought you'd be in bed. Rebellious phase, Dorothy muttered. Amy smiled gently and sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Amy asked, Was your daughter angry? Yes. Is she wrong? Dorothy considered this. No? Amy nodded slowly. But Dorothy stared at the rain. But anger can become a home if you live in it long enough. Amy leaned back in silence. Young people expected emotions to arrive separately. Love, rage, grief, relief. Older people knew they arrived together, a tangled knot impossible to separate cleanly. Do you still love him? Amy asked carefully. Dorothy answered honestly. I don't know who he is anymore. Then after a pause, but I never stopped missing him. The confession surprised even her. Amy's voice softened. That's different, is it? Yes. Dorothy looked at the young nurse, 26 years old, still believing hearts healed neatly. Missing someone, Dorothy whispered, is just love with nowhere to go. Amy reached over and squeezed her hand. And for the first time in decades, Dorothy allowed someone to sit beside her while she carried the weight. 3 days later, Dorothy wrote back, not quickly, not emotionally. Like everything else in her life, she approached it with dignity first. She requested proper stationery from Amy. Cream paper, blue ink, no trembling scribbles. If George Bennett was finally going to hear her voice after 40 years, then he would hear it clearly. Dorothy sat at her small desk by the window while morning sunlight touched the edges of the page. For nearly an hour, she wrote nothing. Because where did one begin after 40 years of silence? Dear George, no. She crossed it out. George, the simplicity felt colder, safer. Then slowly, carefully she began. You asked for the truth, so I will give you mine. When you disappeared, the police asked me whether I believed you would abandon your family willingly. I told them no. I lied for you before I understood what you had done. Her pen paused. Outside, birds moved through wet garden hedges. Inside the care home, breakfast carts rattled faintly through corridors. Life continuing again. Always continuing. She kept writing. For years I defended you, even after hope became humiliation. Even after neighbors stopped looking at me with sympathy and started looking at me with suspicion. Do you know what people say about women whose husbands vanish? They assume there was a reason. Dorothy's jaw tightened. 40 years of swallowed pain flowed calmly onto paper now. Not dramatic. That was what made it devastating. I worked nights cleaning offices while the children slept. Michael developed your habit of chewing his sleeve when nervous. Claire forgot your face by age 9. Anna hated you longest because she remembered you best. There were birthdays, funerals, school graduations. I attended them all alone. You became a ghost that lived at our dinner table. Every sentence revealed suffering she had buried beneath routine for decades. Not because she wanted pity, because survival had required silence. Finally, after several pages, she wrote the question that truly mattered. Why did you decide we were better off believing you dead? Dorothy stopped there. Her eyes burned. Not from tears, from exhaustion. 40 years compressed into one sentence. She almost ended the letter then, but one final thought emerged quietly from somewhere deep inside her. And she wrote it before courage disappeared. I need you to understand something clearly. You did not merely leave. You erased me from my own life. When people disappear, those left behind stop belonging anywhere. Widows receive sympathy. Divorced women receive explanations. But women like me become questions nobody wants to answer. She signed only her name. Not love, not sincerely, just Dorothy. When she finished, her hands trembled violently. Amy entered later carrying fresh towels and found Dorothy staring at the sealed envelope. You wrote it. Dorothy nodded. How do you feel? Dorothy thought carefully before answering. Terrified. Amy sat beside her. Because of what he might say? No. Dorothy looked down at the letter. Because after 40 years, I finally admitted how much it hurt. Amy said nothing. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing one person could offer another. The letter was mailed that afternoon, and once it was gone, waiting became its own kind of suffering. Days stretched strangely afterward. Every sound at the nurse's desk made Dorothy look up. Every arrival of post tightened her chest. At night, she dreamed of George standing at the end of hospital corridors she could never reach. In one dream, he turned around at last and had no face. The reply arrived 11 days later. Thicker envelope. Same blue ink. Dorothy carried it unopened to her room, locked the door, sat beside the window while rain moved softly against the glass. Then she began to read. Dorothy, there is no version of this story that excuses me. I need you to know that first. Nothing I say next changes what you suffered. Nothing repairs what I destroyed. But you deserve the truth before I die. Dorothy's pulse quickened. 40 years narrowing toward explanation. George continued, Do you remember our neighbor Walter Green? The name struck her instantly. Walter, the widower next door who repaired radios in his garage. Quiet man, kind eyes. always bringing vegetables from his garden. George wrote, "You once asked me why Walter never remarried after his wife died. I told you some men preferred loneliness. That was not true." Dorothy frowned slightly. A strange chill crept slowly across her skin. "I need you to understand the time we lived in. Men were allowed only certain kinds of lives. Certain kinds of love. Anything outside that became shame. Ruin. Violence." Dorothy stopped breathing. "No." George's words blurred briefly before sharpening again. "I met Walter 2 years before I disappeared. And for the first time in my life, I understood something terrible about myself. The room became utterly silent. Not even rain existed anymore, only George's handwriting. I loved you, Dorothy. That is the hardest part to explain. I truly loved you. You were my best friend, the mother of my children, the safest place I ever knew. But there was another truth living inside me simultaneously, one I spent my entire life trying to kill." Dorothy covered her mouth. 40 years of assumptions shattered quietly inside her chest. "Not another woman, never another woman." George continued, "I fought it for years. God knows I fought it. I believed marriage would cure me. Fatherhood would cure me. Time would cure me. Instead, I became two people living inside one body. One man adored his wife. The other woke each morning drowning in shame." Dorothy's hands trembled harder now. She remembered things suddenly. Tiny moments dismissed long ago. George growing tense whenever conversations turned toward masculinity. His strange sadness after church sermons. The distance she once mistook for boredom. Oh God. She kept reading. "Walter understood before I spoke a word. People like us recognized one another silently back then. We never intended anything to happen. But loneliness is dangerous when someone finally sees the truth you've hidden your entire life." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. Not anger now. Something heavier. Recognition. George wrote, "The summer before I disappeared, someone saw us together outside town. Nothing indecent, nothing obvious, but enough. Rumors began. I knew what would happen if they spread further, not only to me, to you, to the children. Men lost jobs over whispers like that. Families became targets. I convinced myself leaving was protection. If I vanished completely, perhaps people would assume another woman. Gambling debts, anything ordinary, anything easier than the truth." Dorothy stared blankly ahead. 40 years. 40 years believing she had failed as a wife. When all along George had been fighting a war inside himself she never even knew existed. Tears slipped silently down her face now. George's writing grew shakier toward the final pages. "Walter left town shortly after I disappeared. We lived together quietly under different names for nearly 30 years. He died 8 years ago. Cancer. I buried the only person who ever fully knew me. And afterward, the guilt became unbearable. Because while I had found freedom too late, you carried punishment for a crime you never committed." Dorothy wept then. Not loudly, not dramatically. The exhausted grief of someone finally understanding the shape of an old wound. George had loved her. That was true, and also impossible. Both things existing together. He wrote, "You asked why I chose death over explanation. Because in those years, Dorothy, men like me believed disappearing was kinder than being known. I see now how wrong I was." The final paragraph nearly broke her. "I have loved 3 people in my life completely. Walter, our children, and you, in different ways, in incomplete ways. But truly, I never stopped carrying you in my heart. Not one day." Dorothy lowered the letter slowly into her lap. Outside, rain streamed gently down the windows. Inside her room, 40 years rearranged themselves into an entirely different story. Not abandonment for another woman, not betrayal in the ordinary sense. George had not left because Dorothy was unlovable. He had left because he believed the truth would destroy all of them. And somehow, tragically, he had been right. For a long time, Dorothy simply sat there, breathing carefully through the shock. Then came another realization. George had suffered too. Not instead of her, alongside her, entire lives wasted by fear. She thought about the decades they lived in. Cruel years, years when people disappeared pieces of themselves simply to survive. How lonely George must have been. How terrified. And suddenly Dorothy remembered something small and devastating. The night before he vanished, George had stood in the kitchen doorway watching her wash dishes, not speaking, just watching her quietly. At the time, she thought he looked tired. Now she understood. He had been saying goodbye. Amy found Dorothy hours later, still sitting motionless beside the window. The letter rested open in her lap. Amy read enough of Dorothy's face to understand immediately. Oh, Dorothy nodded once. He loved men. Amy sat carefully beside her. And you? Dorothy laughed softly through tears. I think he loved me too. The tragedy of that sentence filled the room completely. Weeks later, Dorothy decided to see him. Anna refused outright. Absolutely not. He destroyed our family. Yes, you owe him nothing. I know. Then why? Dorothy looked at her daughter carefully. Because I finally understand him. Anna shook her head angrily. No, don't do that. Don't make this noble. I'm not. Yes, you are. Dorothy waited, then said quietly, I spent 40 years believing I wasn't enough for him. Anna fell silent. And now, she asked. Dorothy looked toward the window. Now I know the tragedy wasn't that he didn't love me. Her voice broke gently. It's that he never learned how to love himself. Anna cried then, not for George, for all of them, for wasted years, for secrets, for the cruel timing of truth. The hospice sat near the edge of town, surrounded by wet autumn trees. Rain tapped softly against the car windows as Anna drove in silence. At the last moment that morning, she had changed her mind. I'm not letting you go alone, she muttered. Neither mentioned it again. Inside, the building smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies. A nurse guided them quietly down pale corridors. Dorothy's heartbeat echoed painfully inside her chest. 40 years leading toward one final doorway. When the nurse opened it, Dorothy almost didn't recognize him. George looked smaller somehow. Age and illness had hollowed his face into unfamiliar angles. Oxygen tubes curved beneath his nose. Rain blurred the hospital window behind him. But his eyes were exactly the same. George looked up slowly and began to cry. Not dramatically, just silent tears sliding down an old man's face. Dorothy! Her name sounded fragile in his mouth. She stood frozen near the doorway. Anna remained beside her like armor. George saw her too. Anna. She did not answer. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Dorothy crossed the room slowly and sat beside the bed. George stared at her as though memorizing sunlight before darkness. You're beautiful, he whispered. Dorothy almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing that at 77 years old beside a dying man. Instead, she said, you look terrible. And unexpectedly, George smiled, the same sideways smile from the photograph hidden in her drawer. For a moment, they were young again. Then the oxygen machine hissed softly, pulling reality back into the room. I'm sorry, George whispered. Dorothy nodded once. I know. No, he said weakly. You don't. There aren't words large enough. Anna stood near the window, arms crossed tightly against herself. George looked toward her carefully. I thought leaving would protect you. Anna's voice finally emerged, sharp with pain. You erased us. George closed his eyes. Yes, silence settled again. Rain tapping glass. Machines humming softly. 3 lives sitting inside the wreckage of one decision. Finally, Dorothy asked the question she had carried for decades. Why didn't you tell me the truth? George looked at her with unbearable sadness. Because I was raised to believe the truth made me monstrous. Dorothy felt tears sting her eyes again. Not because she excused him, because she finally understood the fear. George turned toward the rain-streaked window. I wanted so badly to be the man you deserved. You were, Dorothy whispered before she could stop herself. He looked at her sharply. No, she corrected softly, not entirely, but part of you was. George began crying harder then. Weak shoulders shaking beneath thin hospital blankets. I loved our life, he whispered. That was the terrible thing. I loved sitting at the dinner table with you. I loved hearing the children laugh upstairs. I loved every ordinary moment. Dorothy reached out instinctively and covered his trembling hand with hers. If you like this story, press like button. This helps to grow channel and to reach these stories to more people like you. Old reflexes surviving catastrophe. George looked down at their hands together. I used to dream about growing old beside you, he admitted. Dorothy smiled sadly. You did grow old beside me? He frowned slightly, and she squeezed his hand gently. You just weren't there to see it. The sentence shattered something inside the room. Anna turned away crying quietly. George's breathing grew weaker. The nurse entered briefly, adjusted medication, then disappeared again. Time narrowing now. Dorothy knew it. George knew it too. He looked at her one last time. Did you ever hate me? Dorothy considered the question honestly for a long time. And now she looked at the dying man before her, the frightened young husband he once was. The decades of shame, the impossible choices, the loneliness. And finally she understood something surprising. Hatred had exhausted itself years ago. Only grief remained. George whispered, I never stopped loving you. Dorothy leaned closer. Then she spoke 4 words that neither of them had expected. I know. Rest now. George closed his eyes, and for the first time in 40 years, peace entered his face. He died 2 days later. Dorothy returned to the care home beneath a sky washed silver with rain. Everything looked unchanged. The same flowers near reception, the same distant television noise, the same faint smell of tea and old carpet. But something inside her had shifted quietly, like a locked window finally opening after decades. Amy met her near the entrance. How are you feeling? Dorothy thought about it carefully, then answered, lighter. And it was true, not happy. Not healed entirely, but lighter. That evening she sat beside her window watching dusk settle across the garden. On the bedside table rested George's photograph. Not hidden anymore. Visible. Honest. Amy noticed it immediately while bringing evening medication. You moved the picture. Dorothy nodded. I think hiding it was exhausting me. Amy smiled softly. Do you forgive him? Dorothy looked at the photograph a long time before answering. The young man smiling beneath summer trees. The older man dying beneath rain-streaked windows. The same person, and not the same at all. Finally, Dorothy spoke. I think forgiveness arrives quietly. Amy tilted her head. What do you mean? Dorothy folded her hands carefully in her lap. For years I thought forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened. She looked back toward the darkening window, but it isn't that. Outside, rain began softly again, steady against the glass. Warm light filled the small room behind her. Dorothy continued, it means accepting that people are often weaker, sadder, and more frightened than we ever realize. Amy sat beside her silently. The young nurse still learning that life rarely divided neatly into heroes and villains. Dorothy smiled faintly. George made terrible choices, but he was also a man born into a world that taught him to hate himself. She touched the corner of the photograph gently, and hatred spreads, even inward. For the first time in decades, she no longer felt abandoned when she looked at his face. Only sadness for both of them. Two people who might have lived differently in a kinder world. Down the hallway, someone laughed loudly at a television program. A kettle whistled downstairs. Life continued, as it always did. Dorothy leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes briefly. The weight she had carried for 40 years no longer pressed quite so heavily against her ribs. Not because the past changed, because the truth finally had a name. And somehow, naming pain made it easier to set down. Before bed, Dorothy opened the drawer beside her bed one last time, empty now except for old handkerchiefs and reading glasses. She smiled softly to herself. Then she placed the drawer gently shut. The photograph remained outside, in the light, where it belonged. Forgiveness is not a gift we give others. It is a gift we finally give ourselves. Share this with someone carrying something heavy today.